Okay, colleagues, greetings and welcome back. And I really hope we're live this time. So I wanted to do a quick video in response to a wonderful question from a student the other day. And the question basically had to do with free will and determinism, and especially the relation of these concepts to our criminal justice system, right? And these days, I find more and more that actually for the students, a natural assumption tends to be determinism, right? If we take on board the physicalist picture of the universe, the standard model of particle physics, the advances in neurophysiology, and those kinds of fields, right? More and more students are assuming automatically that determinism is true. And so the question now is, if determinism is true, why isn't the criminal justice system on board with this new worldview, if you want? And so I wanted to give, I myself subscribe to, broadly speaking, hypothetically, tentatively subscribe to the determinist picture. So I would call myself a determinist. So if you like to be pedantic, skeptic first, determinist second. But to me, determinist picture makes the most sense. Anyway, so as a determinist, tentative determinist myself, I want to give an account of how determinists think about criminal justice system on the one hand, and on the other hand, I think that if we think this through, actually this thinking about the justice system provides an important argument for determinism. Actually, right? So let me advance the thesis. The thesis is basically that criminal punishment really only makes sense if we assume determinism. So determinism is not a problem for the criminal justice system. No, it only really makes sense if determinism is true. And specifically, if determinism were false, then first of all, punishment cannot deter crime, right? Because again, presumably, the threat of punishment exerts causal influence on the functioning of the psyche of a potential criminal, right? And being, afraid of the punishment, right? It's as if the punishment pulls a certain lever, pulls a certain handle in the brain of the criminal, and disincentivizes them from committing crimes. But in order for this to be true, there needs to be a lever in the head, if you want, metaphorically speaking, right? And without this assumption, punishment, again, without the assumption of some form of psychological determinism, punishment would not be effective, would not be efficient. Right? It would not actually deter criminals. It is only because the criminals are determined by their psychology, only because of that, we can, so to speak, push buttons in their head to stop them from committing crimes, right? One reason, right? And the other reason is that on the deterministic picture, we understand what we mean when we talk about identity of a person through time, right? So we ascribe causal powers. We ascribe continuity through time to a certain structure in the person or in the brain. Well, it's probably, cognition is embodied, so you shouldn't just say in the brain, I guess, but like in the physical body of a person, there's a certain continuity of causal states. And obviously, when I act in the world, my action is a result of the environment, right? But also it is a result of the structure of my psychology, if you want. So most anatomically normal human beings have stable character traits, if you want. And this is what determinists, when they talk about a person acting, this is what they mean, right? To be free, quote unquote, within this picture, in compatibilist jargon, to be free is to be determined by the right kinds of causes, namely internal psychological causes, right? And because there's a continuity of these normal psychological causes, because of that, we can ascribe responsibility to a person for their past actions. Now, if determinism were false somehow, right? So within the deterministic picture, we know when we talk about continuity, we know the continuity of what we are talking about. So specifically, we're talking about continuity, continuity of I don't know, stable causal psychological structure. So if you want stable character traits. roughly speaking. But if determinism were false and the actions of human beings were, let's say, caused by some immaterial, immortal soul which is separate from the body, then you could ask the following question: well, what guarantees, what makes sure that the body is continually inhabited by the same soul? Could it be the case that the soul is being created or destroyed every moment, created and destroyed every moment, right? Or some scenario like this. I think John Locke had an intimation of a similar thought experiment, right? So it could be that, like, again, if determinism is false, what is there to guarantee that you are not punishing a different soul attached to the same body, which strictly speaking is not responsible for the action anymore? Anyway, something like that. That's the thesis. The thesis, again, is that criminal punishment only makes sense if we assume determinism. Let me talk about this some more. So this is my general plan. Justice makes sense only in light of determinism, criminal justice system. So the purpose of punishment, and I'm thinking of maybe John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. I think Locke puts this very well. The purpose of punishment is first and foremost prevention of crime. So there's you provide a negative example to the people in order to deter them from committing similar crimes in the future, because people presumably don't like crime. Again, notice, people talk about human nature, and sometimes talking about human nature is very controversial. But look, we always every day we make assumptions about human nature, and certain fairly stable human nature, right? So we assume that people don't like physical punishment, right? Flogging, right? And like the human beings dislike this kind of physical interaction enough that you can influence their body, influence their psychology through threat of physical punishment, or through threat of incarceration, or through threat of monetary punishment, right? So, and we assume that human beings have a stable human nature like that. We assume that nobody actually likes or wants to go to prison, or nobody actually likes or wants to be fined under normal circumstances, right? So we're talking about crime prevention. This example, there's quarantine. And notice, revenge, most people, well, I think I say most people, I think there's a good argument to say that revenge is actually always irrational. Revenge is kind of a problematic idea in general. If we assume determinism, revenge is definitely irrational. But even if you don't assume determinism, I think that there's something problematic about the idea of revenge. Now, there's also maybe an idea of restitution. So let me add this to the board. Restitution, and this is another thing that Locke talks about. I think restitution. So it's like, again, if I steal something from you, right? I now have to either give it back, provide some equivalent compensation, or also maybe some compensation for moral damage, not in addition to physical damage, moral damage, that kind of thing, right? So, but I think we can bracket the question of restitution, which is exactly what I'm doing on the board. Anyway, so again, the first idea is that, again, if we want to prevent crime, right? So we want to give a negative example and quarantine the individuals. And again, so far we're fine with from the standpoint of determinism. Again, in fact, example would deter only if people are determined by internal psychological causes. And likewise, again, I mentioned this already in my thesis, but again, if you talk about question of responsibility and question of quarantine, why would you want to quarantine individuals, right? So you quarantine individuals because you assume that there's a stable character trait, right? A deterministic, psychological, stable character trait that this particular person has propensity to commit crime as a result of genetics or upbringing, some sort of nuanced combination of nature and nurture, but still they have this propensity, and that's why we want to quarantine them from society at large. Now, again, I should also, another question that you can ask is, what is the best way to organize the penal system? And that's a separate question that I want to, I don't want to talk about in this video. In fact, a lot of people, maybe as they're listening to this video, would think, well, our penal system today in many countries, or maybe in most countries, is terribly inhumane and inefficient. And that may be the case. I don't know. I'm not an expert in this stuff. I don't necessarily want to talk about this time. So I want to bracket this question as well. But let me continue, right? So actually, when you talk about court trials, and I have some experience with criminal justice system, I don't want to go into this right now, so some first-hand experience. But from my understanding, again, the question that is asked of the jury is usually not about this indeterministic free will type of question, is this person ontologically responsible for their action? No, I think that, the question that we ask of the jury is that, has it been proven beyond reasonable doubt that person A is causally responsible for action B, right? And again, this idea that, compatibilism is a certain way of talking about free will. So yeah, I am a determinist, but I still think that there's a certain sense of the word free, if you want, I don't know, people politically free. So like if you take my body if you throw it out the window and I land on somebody's car and trash it, I'm not responsible because you have taken my body and you have thrown it out the window. However, let's say if I jump out the window of my own accord, land on a car and trash it, now I'm responsible. So the question is, again, to be free in this compatibilist picture is simply to be caused by the right kinds of causes. So like internal psychological causation, not external force. So internal, like not abnormal, right? So normal psychological causation. And okay, yeah, we talk about upbringing and genetics. Again, this nature-nurture debate into which I don't want to go into right now. But still, it's there. So we should keep it in mind, right? And so again, notice, so on the indeterminist picture, sometimes people call this libertarian free will. I'm not sure I like this argument. I like this term very much. But like, if we assume that people are ontologically free to create their actions ex nihilo, so to speak, from nothing, right? So let me maybe add this to the slide. So ontological freedom to create uncaused, miraculous, right, actions ex nihilo, because this is what it takes for human beings to be ontologically free, and we are basically appealing to a miracle in this case, right? If crime was a result of this kind of uncaused miracle, then the threat of punishment would not prevent crime, right? And there would also be no reason to quarantine people. Again, I hope that some of these analogies are sticking. So let me. I want to keep this video short, so let me wrap this up. So why do we have ideas of free will at all? And I think it's an important task and maybe a video for another day. I think there's good evolutionary psychological reasons as to why people evolve notions of free will. Why do we have these notions in general? Like, genealogical, genetic account of why people have this false impression. I'm not sure if this applies to all cultures around the world, but I think, especially, post-Abrahamic religious traditions tend to have this embedded in their culture, especially like in the West these days. And so, like in the Abrahamic tradition, and for people like Immanuel Kant, I think it's very clear why you need to assume something like free will, right? Because you have this notion that again, Kant says this very explicitly, that morality requires free will. And when he says morality, he thinks all morality, but actually it's Kant's morality. It's a version of Christian morality, specifically this notion of sending people to hell for all eternity. So not to be facetious about this, right? But the idea is that like God would be a jerk if God sent people to hell for the actions for which, strictly speaking, they're not responsible. But what is responsible for their actions are the laws of the universe, physical laws of the universe, right? Anyway, so yeah. So I want to say there's this assumption that you want to send people to hell for all eternity, and that's why you need to postulate or assume free will. Let me also add maybe to this slide. There's a famous argument from Hannah Arendt who talks about the invention of free will at the time when political will is in decline, when political freedom is in decline, by the Stoics and the Christians, basically as a response to the decline in the political freedom of the ancient world. It's an interesting argument. I want to, make a note that it's there. Maybe at some point in the future, it would be a nice topic for a video to talk about this in detail, right? And of course, people who want to criticize Abrahamic traditions, or people in general who have different assumptions, right, would not agree with this notion that, again, sending people to hell for all eternity is a good justification for assuming free will, right? So Friedrich Nietzsche, very famously says that the freedom of the will is precisely the invention of the priests in order to justify, this moral responsibility, sending people to hell for all eternity. So again, this suspicion, Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, Marx, Darwin, the hermeneutics of suspicion, right? So for Marx, in a similar fashion, again, you can have this notion that freedom of the will is some kind of, ideology, maybe a slave-owning ideology or a feudal ideology or a capitalist ideology. This notion that our actions are result of our own internal psychological causes, and if I'm rich, it's because I'm a wonderful, hardworking person, and if I'm poor, that's because I myself am to blame, right? Whereas Marx, in many ways, is the founder of the social sciences, and Nietzsche, I suppose, especially through his influence on Freud, is the founder of psychology, right? So, but anyway, so Marx, one of the founders of the academic discipline of sociology, I would say, right? This idea that no, there's a structure to the social system, right? That people are, to a large extent, role takers, right? We are born into certain positions in society, and these objective material circumstances define or partially determine what's going to happen to us in life, and it's not really a question of this quote-unquote free will, right? Let me also make a very short note that, of course, this can open a whole other can of worms. If you talk about, well, okay, but when we talk about these psychological causes, determinism, what is personal identity, right? And so let me nod, let me respectfully make a bow in the direction of the Buddha. Let me nod in the direction of the Buddha, right? Because again, this very important doctrine, especially in early Buddhism, of non-self, or anatman, right, in Sanskrit. Again, this notion actually that the self does not exist, which I think aligns very well with this idea of again, internal, this stream of internal psychological causes being the only way to determine continuity, right? And so this actually, you ask this question: where does continuity come from? Sort of, if there's no self, what is reborn, if you want, right? And the Buddhists talk about, I think that the standard account is to say that actually it's karma that's being reborn, not the soul, but karma. And karma is an external causal structure. And external causal structure. And on this picture, there's no such thing as personal identity. Personal identity is imposed from without by this external causal structure, which, so to speak, imposes or creates an appearance of, imposes apparent identity through time. Identity and continuity through time. Right. Anyway, so yeah, so hermeneutics of suspicion. Masters of suspicion. Nietzsche, Freud, Marx, and always, of course, we must add Darwin. So I also had another slide, this kind of as a postscriptum. Let me mention this very briefly. So when you talk about Kant, how did Kant actually imagine this is going to work? Oh, it's a whole separate discussion. Maybe we should make another video. But I just wanted to note that I'm not sure. So some people can talk about God of the gaps, but here we can talk about freedom of the gaps. So God of the gaps, and we can talk about freedom of the gaps, right? So so people have a certain notion of I don't want to say, yeah, so people have a certain folk notion, they have a certain belief that they're used to, that they have a certain element in their worldview, which they're attached to, right? And then science begins to creep up on that, like, just to some extent, obviously, science has crept up on the theological worldview, on the religious worldview. It carved away elements or ideas which belonged to religion, right? And in the same fashion, science, especially neuroscience, seems to carve away at our ideas about ourselves, right? And so people are trying to save their own worldview by saying, look, come on, science cannot explain everything, so these gaps, right, are still, I'm going to fill them with my old ideas about God, or in this case, ideas of freedom. So freedom of the gaps. Again, maybe could make a whole other video about this. So it's like we say, oh, science cannot explain human behavior 100%, so all this residue we're going to attribute to free will. And there's actually a wonderful, well, again, there's all sorts of things I can say about this, but there's a wonderful recent interview by Sean Carroll with with Robert Sapolsky, right? And I should put a link in the description. Sapolsky has a very nice phrase. I think that he opens the interview by saying that basically we call freedom the unexplained remainder, right? Something that remains, after we do a scientific explanation or something like that, right? And also there's another interview between Sean Carroll and Daniel Dennett, who's another famous compatibilist, and they talk about similar notions here. So this is something I can immediately recommend of sort of easier ways to listen to this. But notice again, I think that Kantian worldview, and I promised this was going to be a postscriptum, so let me wrap this up as fast as possible. So Kant very famously stated that there will never be a Newton for a blade of grass. Kant writes this in the Critique of Power of Judgment, right? And I feel that at the end of the day, really, in order to believe in free will, we need to bracket out. We need to close our eyes on the advances in neuroscience. And this is the problem, that in pre-Darwinian times, people like Immanuel Kant had these notions, but after Darwin, after the discovery of the DNA, after our progress in the understanding of the neurophysiology of the brain, these things just don't hold water. And I think again, this is a problem. This is a problem that Kant explicitly believes. Again, notice, very bold statement. He says there will never be a Newton for a blade of grass. Well, a lot of people would say, and I think that's important, right, that Darwin is the Newton for the blade of grass. And this worldview is it's very problematic to hold on to in this post-Darwinian age. Okay, anyway, this has gone on for slightly longer than I planned. So let me wrap this up here. I hope this is stimulating. In general, I suppose I should remind everyone, in the spirit of open discussion, that again, I am a determinist second, but a skeptic first. I have this great commitment to John Stuart Mill's ideal of free and equal discussion. So in general, I think that if you want to advance a view, of course you need to know what are the best arguments against your view. So I would definitely welcome disagreement and debate. I don't want you to think, oh, the issue is settled, right? Let's keep thinking about this. Let's keep thinking about this. I hope you have found this stimulating. I hope that maybe some of you will come back with some interesting counter arguments to determinist position, which will hopefully make me enable me to progress in my thinking on this issue. So basically, that's it for now. Thank you for your company. Stay safe, take care, and I'll see you next time.